I can see people are arriving. Okay, I think we're going to get started. Since it's a little after 7, I want to say good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Atlantic Book Awards event, Poetry and Prose, a discussion of craft, and it's presented in partnership with the Writers' Federation of Nova Scotia. And my name is Amanda Peters, and I'm a board member at the Writers' Federation of Nova Scotia. And I'm also trying to be a storyteller. So I'm very honored to be with everybody tonight. And I was lucky enough to receive copies of all the books. And I have read everybody's, except for yours, Anne. It's a little thick, so I'm only halfway through, but I'm loving it. So before we get started, I just wanted to mention that if any of you have questions, any of those in the audience have questions for the authors while you're watching, there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and you can type them there, and then we'll come back to them at the end of the discussion. So our conversation is going to last about 40 minutes, and then at the end, we can ask all the questions of the authors. So first, I'm going to introduce our esteemed panelists. Tammy Armstrong has published 2 novels and 4 collections of poetry. Her first collection of poetry, Bogman's Music, was a finalist for the Governor General's Literary Award. Recent work has won the I. Yeats International Poetry Prize, the Prairie Fire's Bliss Carmen Poetry Prize. In 2018, she was a finalist for the National Magazine Awards. She lives in southwestern Nova Scotia. Year of the Metal Rabbit won the 2021 Maxine Tynes Nova Scotia Poetry Award. Welcome to Tammy. Afua Cooper is Halifax's 7th Poet Laureate and the author of 5 books of poetry, including the critically acclaimed Copper Woman and Other Poems, and 2 novels, The Hanging of Angelique, The Untold Story of Slavery in Canada, and The Burning of Old Montreal. And my name is Phyllis Wheatley. She has also recorded 2 poetry CDs, including the forthcoming Love and Revolution. A founder of the Canadian dub poetry movement, Afua Cooper was instrumental in organizing, between 2004 and 2009, 3 international dub poetry festivals. Her poetry book, Black Matters, featuring photographs by Wilfred Roser, won the 2021 J.M. Abram Poetry Award and was nominated for the APMA Best Atlantic Published Book Award. Welcome, Afua. Thank you. David Huebert has won the Walrus Poetry Prize, the CBC Short Fiction Prize, and has twice been a finalist for the National Magazine Awards. David's poems have been published in magazines such as Prairie Fire, Event, and The Walrus. His poetry chapbook, Full Montegreens with Andy Verbloom, won the Frog Hollow Chapbook Contest in 2016. He lives, writes, and teaches in Halifax, Nova Scotia in Mi'kma'ki. David's fiction debut, Peninsula Sinking, won the Jim Connors Dartmouth Book Award and was shortlisted for the Alistair MacLeod Short Fiction Prize. He was runner-up for the Donalda Gleed Literary Award. His latest book, Humanimus, was nominated for the 2021 J.M. Abram Poetry Award. Welcome, David. Anne Simpson is the author of 10 books of fiction, poetry, and nonfiction. 4 of her books have been included in the Globe and Mail's 100 Best Books of the Year. Her poetry collection, Loop, was awarded the Griffin Poetry Prize, and her novel, Falling, was longlisted for the International Dublin Literary Award and winner of the Dartmouth Award for Fiction. She lives in Antigonish, Nova Scotia. Her novel, Speechless, won the 2021 Thomas Rattle Atlantic Fiction Award. So welcome to Anne. Yay, welcome all of you. I'm very excited to be here with all you this evening. So we're going to jump right in. We're going to talk a little bit about craft, and it's very exciting because we have some fiction and some poetry here here. So first I'm going to start, just because of the way the world works right now, I have you on my screen this way. So I'm just going to go from left to right. So we're going to start with Tammy. And Tammy, I just wanted to ask for You're the Metal Rabbit. What was your inspiration? Where did you find your inspiration for that book, for that collection?
I wrote it over about 7 years, and in that time I lived in 3 cities in 2 countries, and I traveled to a lot of other places in Europe. And this was during a time when we had a lot of migrations coming into Italy, and I'd spent time in Sicily and Italy, and there just seemed to be so much movement, I think, and I was driving a lot at the same time, so I didn't have I guess I didn't have a way to just say this is the place where I live and I'm familiar with everything around me. I seem to be moving, and everyone around me seemed to be moving all the time. So a lot of the poems, I think, came from that. How do you define a place that you're not spending a lot of time in? What are the questions that you can create about that unsettledness that you feel? And I was finishing my doctorate work on critical animal studies and poetry, so I really wanted to look at how are those encounters with the more than human. How is that also part of how I define my place?
Wow, that's really interesting. Thank you for that.
Sure.
Afua, where do you find your inspiration, particularly with your book Black Matters, your collection? Because the poetry and the photography was just brilliant.
Thank you. So speaking of Black Matters in terms of inspiration, it was an idea. It's still an idea that I have about going about the world, beginning in Canada, and looking at the experience of Black people, people of the African diaspora. And so I started writing about 2017. It's something that just evolved. And then in that year I was in Germany, and the following year I was in Germany, 2018, doing some work with Wilfred Rosert, because he's a professor of North American Studies at Bielefeld University in Germany. And I went there and did a class with his master's students who are studying North American literature. And out of that, just being in that space, the collaboration came about, because Willie's also a photographer.
Mm-hmm.
And he does a lot of work in these Americas, in North America, South America, and the Caribbean islands and Central America. And he's particularly interested in the African diaspora too. So that's how the collaboration came about. We exchanged poems and photographs. I would write to the photograph. Sometimes I didn't. Sometimes I would write a poem or had the idea for a poem and would talk to him about it. And either he'd have the photographs or he'd take new ones. But the collaboration evolved that way. And meanwhile, we were traveling. I was separately, he was traveling, I was traveling. We were in Mexico once together. And one of the things there is almost, we paid attention to Hispanic America, which is usually within Anglo America. We usually don't seem to remember the African diaspora in other places, like in Iberia, America, for example. So it came out of that because I wanted to document as much as possible this experience of Black people worldwide. So you see in the book about Lisbon, in Germany, in different places in Canada, in Halifax. That's how that came about. So it was really nice. Later on, as we keep talking, I just want to talk about how the ease of it, the ease of doing it. And so it was really sweet and really beautiful.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to go to Anne next. So Anne, where did you find your inspiration for Speechless?
I'm unmuted now. Well, so I was really interested in who can tell a story, who should tell a story, who can tell a story, who has the power to tell a story, who doesn't have the power to tell a story. And so my novel is about really two cultures meeting. And it's about a young Canadian reporter. She's white and she is in Nigeria and she works as a freelance reporter. And she is ambitious and young, and she wants a good story. And eventually she happens upon a story about Aisha, who's a Nigerian teenager. And so again, it's kind of like the writer telling the story also has to ask herself, who should tell a story? So I was really conscious of this all the way through. I was thinking, well, this reporter has, she's digging for something here. And Aisha has been convicted, sentenced to death because of adultery. So under Sharia law, she was convicted and sentenced. And so she is able to keep her child long enough to wean her. So she has several years grace. And at this point, the Canadian, Sophie, comes into the picture and tells the story, and because Aisha can't. And so she tells it for all the, in some ways, all the right reasons and all the wrong reasons. You know, she gets herself into hot water, she gets Aisha into hot water, you know, everybody she's in touch with. So I wanted to look at this whole notion of who's responsible and who has the power, and can we, so Sophie is very young and untried, and I thought, okay, well, this is kind of interesting because it brings up Chimamanda Adichie, who's a Nigerian novelist, whose work I really respect, and it brings up the question, how does one become an ally? And so I was really curious about this whole thing, and it meant that the novel took a very long time to write, because again, I kept asking myself the question, do I have the right? So I went to Boston and talked to a woman called Hawa Ibrahim, who had represented a lot of young women in Nigeria. And she understood both Nigerian common law, so British common law, and she understood Sharia law. So she was versed in both and was able to help in these situations. And so talking to her was such an eye-opening experience, and she was very gracious. So I learned so much about that. And so I would say that she really did help me in understanding what Aisha was up against. But it had a lot to do as well with my work, as so a long time ago, I was a QSO teacher in Nigeria for several years. And so it kind of grows out of that. And where do we meet? Where do we find not just the single story, as Chimamanda Adichie says, but where do we find the story of multiple points of view? So that's what I was interested in.
When I was reading it, and I'm still reading it, but I felt that I wasn't reading something that was unfamiliar. So I could tell that perhaps you had been there or lived there. So that was really, it makes the story engrossing. So, okay, David, your turn. Where do you find your inspiration, and particularly for this collection?
Thank you. Yeah, great question. Yeah, the collection was a long time in the making, and channeled some strange pockets of my mind, I would say. And I think that's what sort of ended up uniting this collection, was just sort of some of the weird searches that I was interested in my intellectual journey. So I was also doing a PhD, also in animal studies, like someone else on this panel, when I was, during a lot of the time that I was writing these poems. So I was thinking a lot about animals. So clearly thinking about animals in extinction, thinking about sort of some of the very, very threatened ways that animals exist for us today. So there's a lot of poems that engage with those ideas. And what I'm really interested in is the way that humans and animals and machines come together. And that's one of the sort of uniting theoretical threads that brings these poems together. I mean, obviously I'm a person, so I'm going to be pretty interested in people. Animals are a very charismatic and traditional feature of poetry writing. But animals always exist for us in dialogue with technology or in conversation with technology. So they're always, our relationships with animals are almost always technologically mediated. Anyway, so animals, humans, oil. I'm very interested in oil. There's a whole section about oil in the book. That's a sort of ongoing area of aesthetic research and interest for me, is oil and sort of where oil comes from and how we came to exist in a society where we're burning it. We don't need to burn oil, right? There's other ways to relate to oil that might be more, oil's not bad, right? This is one of the things that really interests me. It's the way that we treat oil that's the problem. But anyway, and so sort of pushing the limits of my own ecological thinking and ecological imagination is what, in the form of poetry, is what this book really tries to do. And in the end, that ends up being a sort of an attempt to look at language itself as organism, I guess. And so thinking about, Jacques Derrida has said something to this effect, right? He thinks of language itself as a zoon, a creature, right? So I'm trying to look in the final section where I'm really most invested in sort of fixed forms. Shout out to Andy Verboom, who actually invented the Mondegreen form with which a lot of my sort of, with which I play a lot in the final section here. So in that final section, I'm trying to take some of these broader ecological concerns and sort of run language itself, run the limitations of my own language through the meat grinder of the form of poetic constraint in various ways. Yeah.
Okay. I'm actually reading a book right now, and he says that if you're only using language to convey information, you're doing it wrong. So it should be more than that. So I was like, oh, that's mind-blowing. So that's kind of what I got from you. So all of your work seem to be very fitting to the ecological, the social, the cultural climate that we're living in today. So it's very interesting. So now that I've warmed you up, we're going to talk a little bit about craft. So I want to know from you, is there a particular artist who's inspired your craft work, how you write your work, and what have you learned from them? And I'm going to mix it up right now, and I'm going to start with Anne.
Oh, okay. I guess I didn't mute. There's always that, race to the microphone and see if it's. Well, I was thinking, it's an interesting question, because for every book, it's something different that you're learning, and within that book, there's something else you're learning, as you go along. So different, poetry and fiction. But I would say something that I was really wanting to learn, wanting to understand. I think I'm fascinated by how we represent consciousness in novels or in poetry. How do we do that? What do we do if somebody has dementia? How do we represent that then in a poem? Or and in Speechless, what I was interested in was, how do you show the way that memory is just a part of the very fabric of your thinking, so that it's like there's something going on in your memory at the same time as you're speaking to someone else. So the writer that I was looking at for that, I went back to Faulkner's Sound and the Fury, to Benji, and that was just so remarkable to think about how he conveyed Benji as a character in The Sound and the Fury. And then someone else who's really quite wonderful, and these are just like just to help me with the notion of memory alone. There's maybe 3 or 4, but the other one who really stands out is Richard Flanagan, who, what is the book? The Narrow Road to the Deep North, I think, in which at the beginning, the memory, he taught me so much about how memory is just a part of the very, a part of it, so much a part of it that you don't need to stop in, you know, how you stop in a novel, there's a gap and then you go back in time. Very often it's done like that. But what I was interested in was the way it was so fluid, the way that he was able to capture memory and just keep going with the story, and a memory and keep going with the story, and oh, there's that memory again. So in terms of craft, just for that one particular thing, I mean, craft in so many ways, it's fantastic. We could go on all night talking about craft, but just in terms of what I was learning, one of the things that I was really learning about was about memory.
Perfect. Thank you. That was an excellent answer. Okay. Next, same question. Like, where did you find your inspiration? What writers do you read for craft and how to inspire you? And I'm going to ask Afua.
Yeah, so for me, I read poetry, and I'm kind of very traditional. I go back to the same old poets that I've been reading since forever. And so two things. And one of the poet is Kamal Brathwaite, who is a Barbadian-born poet who spent a lot of time in Jamaica. He was also a historian. So for me, he was truly a role model, because I'm also a historian. And coming up, I looked at him and his life as, oh, he's a poet, but he's also a historian, so it's possible. But one of Kamal's interventions in world poetry, certainly in Caribbean poetry, is the use of what he calls nation language, which is really the vernacular. So Caribbean patois, Creole. And then he came up with this theoretical concept called Thai dialectics, as opposed to Marx's dialectics. And Thai dialectics is the play of the ocean. Because I'm born in Jamaica, and which is a West Indian island or a Caribbean island. And so the ocean is with us all the time. We're islands surrounded by the sea, by the Atlantic Ocean. And the tide is always important. Same thing here in Nova Scotia. So this idea of Thai dialectics, examining the issue or the history of slavery and its impact on the Black collective in the Caribbean and around the world, the role that the sea played in shaping our memory. So I read Kamal's, his work like Mother Poem, The Arrivants, Middle Passage. It's a trilogy of work in which his inspiration was standing on the shoreline in Barbados, on the south coast of Barbados, and then on the east coast, and looking across the ocean. And you go across the ocean, and the land mass that you come upon is Africa. So Barbados is the closest West Indian island to Africa. It's 4,000 miles away, but if you keep going across the Atlantic, you're gonna bump up into the African continent. And so as he, imagined the slave ships coming to this side of the world. So I read a lot of Kamal. I read Nazim Hikmet. In fact, there's a poem in the book devoted or dedicated to Nazim Hikmet, Things I Like Doing. The Turkish poet Nazim Hikmet, he has a poem, Things I Like But Didn't Know I Liked. It's really a sweet poem. So I like that poem a lot. So when I wrote the poem that was inspired by the two people decorating the Christmas tree, I dedicated it to Nazim Hikmet. It's called Things I Like Doing. And one is decorating a Christmas tree. Not me personally, because I have never decorated a Christmas tree. I'm speaking to the image. so Hikmet was another poet, and then our two of our Canadian poets, one local, Sue Goyette. I read Oceans. I think, Oceans is really, really fabulous. And I would read snippets of it because in a way I was also dealing with the oceans, the role of the oceans in human life and in the life of the Black community. Certainly the oceans that have shaped our experience in these Americas. And then also Lorna Crozier, who is a Canadian poet from British Columbia. Her work in looking at, people are talking about animals and wildlife, and in her case, the sea, the Pacific Ocean, the whales and the otters and the eagles and the salmon. So she has a really, really nice collection on that. And so those were works that kept me, that fed my soul, so to speak. There were others too, the images and photographs, and also maybe not written text in this case, but the oral stories of my my paternal grandmother. She was a storyteller, and she told a lot of stories about her family and about her marriage to my grandfather. And he died when she was 29 years old. She was a widow at the age of 29. So, and I think a bit of that is reflected in the poem. So having her oral testimony, this oral print was also important. Her voice kept me going through this because I realized that I'm a poet because of her. Actually, I'm a poet because of the context in which I was raised, which is partially in rural Jamaica and the other part in urban Jamaica, in Kingston. And it's people like my grandmother and my aunts who were always telling stories. And I would just be still and listen to them, that eventually, so many years later, it manifested in these works of poetry.
Brilliant. Thank you. I love stories from grandparents. And David, I'm going to go to you next for the inspiration in terms of craft. Like, is there anyone you look to in reference to this collection in particular?
Yeah, it's a very wide-ranging approach to craft. This collection, it's a very sort of there's a lot of nodes in the cosmos of craft, in the cosmos of poetic form. I'm interested particularly because I'm reading this book called Craft in the Real World right now.
Oh, I love that book.
Yeah, which is really great as well, by Matthew Salises, I think. I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce his last name. Yeah, it's a wonderful book. So I'm having trouble thinking about craft without thinking about this book, because it sort of interrogates and critiques the idea that craft is something neutral, which I think is a really important sort of approach right now, and something that's sort of been, germinating in my own mind for a while now, I guess. So yeah, thinking about how craft is not neutral and how the ways it's tied into culture and certain cultural standards, and the way sort of, the way we like to think that the dominant culture's idea of craft is sort of the right craft or the way to do craft. Just an interesting slant on this whole paradigm, I guess. But yeah, I took a lot of different formal directions in this collection. There's fixed forms, there's sonnets, there's sonnetzinos, which are inspired by Canadian poet whose name I'm going to forget at the moment. And then there's Andy Verboom's form, the Mondegreen, which is a form that takes the misheard lyric and tries to intentionally map the misheard lyric, which was a form invented by Sylvia, or an idea invented by Sylvia Wright in her poem Lady Mondegreen, which I'd love to talk more about. And but I don't want to say too much about this idea, but it's all intentional mishearings of lyrics. So we all know these misheard lyrics, right? For example, there's a bad moon on the rise becomes there's a bathroom on the right. We all have this, right? When we mishear a song. And so this form tries to play with that idea of mishearing in order to create creative, intentional mishearings. And what happens is, like all fixed forms in poetry, you sort of run them through this processor and you end up being totally surprised by what you wrote. And it's as if an alien wrote your poem for you. You couldn't possibly have come up with this poem on your own. And yet it, ideally surprises and delights you. Otherwise you throw it out. But you get some good surprising stuff out of this. So that's just one example. I mean, I'm playing with pantoums and other fixed forms throughout. I'm also using lyric poetry. I'm putting pressure on some of these forms, reimagining these forms. There's a sestina that just uses, there's a sestina that's entirely written with without the final word. Although the final word is sort of there in an imaginary way. It's a bit hard to explain, but it comes across on the page. Yeah, so all kinds of different formal inspirations here. One person that I think of when I think of craft, a person that I've been reading lately is Huebert. And I just read him I read him for many, many things. He's a totally brilliant writer. I just read his book on A Tribe Called Quest, which is really marvelous. And I admire how, I really admire what he does with pop music, popular music, and how he makes popular music very, very sophisticated in a literary way, how he's a very deep thinker about pop music and one of the best critics of hip hop, particularly that I've read. And also, I just really admire the rhythm of his prose. And I feel like one of the things about when you're just reading, and his poetry, actually, like his Ode to Prince is one of my favorite poems, because I've always loved Prince, and I've sort of been trying to articulate what it is that I loved about Prince. And I've often sort of wanted to write tributes to Prince. And then I just came across Huebert Ode to Prince, and sort of there it is for me, right? But he's one of those writers where when you're reading his work, you just feel that your internal rhythms are enriched, right? And there's something really, so it's not any one thing that I'm taking from him or borrowing from him. It's just a sense that in reading him, syntax and rhythm of language just becomes musically, whether or not there's any sort of output extractive agenda to that, right? It's just the experience of reading his rhythms makes me feel like a better human being, I guess. And that's sort of what better delight can we have as readers than that? Yeah. So that's what I'll say on craft.
Lots of really good information. And Tammy, we're going to come to you. So who out there in the world of the literary world inspires you in terms of craft? Like, where do you find people have helped you?
I turn a lot to Virginia Woolf's The Waves. And especially when I was working on this collection, she called it a play poem. And to me, it is just pure poetry. I just think it's so marvelous. And I wanted in this collection to have a lot of fractured thoughts, a lot of interruptions, things bumping against each other because you're either trying to define a place that you don't have the means to describe. I always say I lived in Colorado with my husband, and we lived outside Boulder, and he said there are a lot of big cats around here, and I was like, okay. No, he meant mountain lions. I thought he meant like Maine cats or something, just like a big house cat. And so I realized I'm in an environment that I know nothing about, and I don't know anything about rattlesnakes. I don't know about any of these things that could drag me off into the woods. So I really wanted to look at how can you define something when you don't actually I didn't have the language to describe places. I lived in Atlanta. I didn't have the language to describe that because I'm not from there. We spent time in Sicily. I didn't have that. And so I found that Virginia Woolf in The Waves, it's so beautifully written, and she bumps against memory a lot and then sort of moves from character to character very fluidly with these sort of fractured thoughts and fractured sentences that end up telling an entire lifetime with this friendship between these children who meet. And the way that I find her very brave with how she worried a lot about this, because it was so different than any other piece that she wrote. And I can just pick it up anywhere and just randomly read it. And I find like every paragraph is just, it's just so thoughtful with how she describes the minutia in a children's memory and then bounces that off an adult fear, for example, or the natural world against more urban spaces. So she was someone that I went to a lot and found a lot of inspiration from.
Oh, thank you. Okay, I'll have to read that one. And we're
Yeah, it's
running
beautiful.
we're running a little bit short on time before we get to Q&A, but I have one question I want to ask all of you, because you all work in poetry and short story and novel. So from a craft perspective, I want to know, what is your favorite, if you have one, and why that's so? And I think I'm going to start with Afua.
Yeah, my favorite undoubtedly is poetry, because when I write poetry, or even think of writing poetry, it fills me up with joy, really. And it's not as if people who read my work know that some of the work is hard. It's hard. I'm dealing with hard stuff, right? Traumatic stuff, tough stuff that can trigger people. But when I'm in this mode of writing poetry, like this deep and wide expanse just opens up within me. There's no pressure. I feel calm, and there's an eternal quietness inside of me. And the point about no pressure is important because I do academic writing and I feel that there's always a pressure there, right? I have to get this article after this journal at such and such a time and date. And so I'm tense there. Poetry just really allows me to relax. And there's no timeline. Even if there's a timeline, you have to give the publisher the manuscript. There is a timeline. But what I mean is I can come back to the work tomorrow and edit and throw out and include or whatever. And so it's just this space of timelessness. I have this inner timelessness, which I love, which I don't find with even writing a historical novel. I don't find. Thank you.
Okay, next, same question, and I'm gonna go to Tammy.
I would definitely say poetry is where I first go and always have. It's more intimate, I guess. You know, you're sort of, you're dealing more with the given world rather than world building. And so it's sort of just your smaller space, I think, that allows me to putter in a different way than I would. I don't have to create plot or characters, or I can just think of language and think of how something might knock against something else, or syntax, or I could just play around with how lines are on a page. And so it gives you a freedom, I think, that I don't feel like I have to meet any parameters that are, or expectations that you might have in fiction. You can't write an entire novel. You could, but you probably need characters and plot and all of those, that sort of macro language. But with poetry, it's you can work in very small increments and build it and give it lots of time to breathe. And I like that. I like it. It feels more of a relationship with language that way.
I really enjoyed that, working with the given world instead of world building. That's that, for someone who's not a poet, that's very framing for me. Thank you. And next question, I'm going to go to Anne. Same question.
Yeah, this is such a interesting and tough question for me, because I love it all. I love what the essay does. It's so malleable, and I don't write academic. It's not academic writing that I do, so I just find the essay so stretchy and fun and hard at the same time. And then so Tammy mentioned world building in fiction, and it's true. It's, I mean, you have to make it a world, however you do it. And some novels less plot than other novels. But you know, what I'm finding now is, having written a few books and poetry being the kind of touchstone that it is for me, I can sort of take from poetry what it's teaching me or what it's taught me and use it in fiction in a way that I didn't expect. So what I mean by that is, in Falling, there was a young man, an artist, and he's debating about whether he's going to go over Niagara Falls. And so the prose starts to rush in a way that only poetry could have helped me with. And so it rushes on for about 10 pages, and you really don't know what his, well, at least I think you don't know what he's going to do at the end of these 10 pages where it's just a run-on sentence. So I guess I could say that, you know, you learn so much from one genre that can help you with another genre, and you find that, wow, did they ever start to elide into one another in some ways? You know, you couldn't write the one without the other. And I mean, truly, it's a question that is so much fun to answer, because it's you are dependent. I am dependent on these various genres in order to write. I can't do without one. I can't say this is my favorite, this is my baby. But certainly it's so rich, you know, it's just such a rich environment in which to be a writer these days.
Thank you. And of course, David, last but not least, same question.
Yeah, I'm just really enjoying listening to everyone's response and thinking about it also. So thank you all. Yeah, I haven't read Falling, but it sounds very Woolf, reminds me of Virginia Woolf. So I'm excited to check it out, actually, having just read Mrs. Dalloway quite recently. Sounds amazing anyway. Yeah, so I've been dreading this question also, as you can see by my preamble, but I'm just a twitchy thinker and a restless thinker. And that's part of my deal here, is that part of my answer, I guess, is that I don't like to rest in comfort in my writing. And I like to push, I'm always pushing form, I guess. And so I don't really, there's no place where I just feel, there are moments I think that I can carve out for myself of like, okay, I'm like like I'm doing something well for a second here. And that can make me feel good. But then I sort of always want to move on and push into the next thing. So even in other words, so even like, I mean, we can talking about craft or form, no poem or short story is ever the same. Formal experience, right? So everything we're always doing as writers is trying to get something like an idea or an intuition or a feeling, and through some bizarre alchemy, contain it in language in such a way that it excites ourselves and other people. And so that struggle between form and content, right? I think all of us know that we're never actually resting in form. So even within poetry or within fiction, yeah, I'm always trying to land it, right? Trying to throw something in the air and land it, and never quite really getting there. And I think if I got there, I would feel sort of, I'd give up, basically. Yeah, so that's my answer. Is that all right?
Very informative. Thank you all. That was great. I'm learning a lot, actually, in the very short amount of time we have here. So I appreciate it, someone who's still in school studying this stuff. I'm going to move us to the Q&A because we're running out of time. We have 3 questions. So I'm just going to open it up. Oh, look, there's Marianne. So Marianne would like to know, and I think this is towards Anne specifically, how does one become an ally? Such an important question to ponder. I loved how Speechless explored this question in such an open-ended manner. I'm dying to know, Anne, whether you came to any conclusions. Ooh.
Well, you know, I feel like I'm such a beginner here in a way. And yes, I think so. We need to be open to every culture that we can learn from. If we're not open, then, you know, who's going to close the door? Who's going to do that? Especially if you're a writer, you know, the one thing you can do is learn. And so anyway, I think my answer to the question is yes. I think that we can become allies. We have to be ready to learn. We have to be ready for you know, our own, looking at our own privilege, how much it's been there, and for how long, you know, not just my generation, but going back in time. And so it really is a relevant question. I think we need to all be asking it.
Perfect. Anybody else on the panel have any thoughts on that before we move on to the next question? No? Okay. I will go to the next one. David, please tell us about the cover art for your book. So cool. Who created it? And did you have input into it? Again, for Marianne.
Yeah, it's Ellie Hastings from Palimpsest who made this, and she's great and obviously very talented. And it's, you know, please judge my book by its cover is one thing that I like to say here. I just said, for some reason, I just said, oh yeah, tardigrade, also known as water bear, also known as moss sloth or something like that. I'm forgetting right now, but tiny organism and one of the most very, very resilient organism. One of those organisms that people say will survive nuclear holocaust and has survived exposure to space and stuff like that. So, and there's something very spacey about it. And she made this mechanized, as you can see, with gears and whatnot, version of the tardigrade. So it speaks to my thinking on many different levels. Yeah, and so I'm just happy to have my my little companion species present on the cover of this book.
Thank you. It is.
Yeah, it's really nice, David. It's very striking. I am going to judge a book by the cover.
Excellent. Okay, we have another question from Brian Bartlett. And you spoke of writing poetry has fed into your fiction. Does the relationship work in the other direction? So does your fiction influence your poetry? And I'd like to hear from a couple of you on this. This would be interesting.
So you know, my first response when I was sort of thinking about this question was, well, no, it's just, you know, poetry comes first and that's it. And does it work the other way around? And then I thought, yes, in fact, when I'm imagining people, so I imagined a woman who had dementia, and she's being asked the questions that you're asked on the, I think it's a Montreal test. And so she's being asked the questions and she's trying to answer, and that's the poem. And so I had to imagine the woman. In effect, I was making a story. I was imagining the character, you know, so it doesn't usually work that way, but sometimes it does. Sometimes it does mean that I have to think of a character or think of a story. Yeah, thanks.
How about the rest of you? I know most of you said poetry, so is there any way that it goes the other way? Anybody?
I find for me, sometimes there's certain topics that can only be dealt with in poetry or in prose or in both. So when I was writing the book, which isn't a novel, people call it a novel, The Hanging of Angelique, it's actually a historical text. I wrote 3 poems because there's some things that I wanted to say and I wanted to say them immediately, and the prose takes time. And so I was doing 2 things at the same time. I needed to get at it, and poetry had this, well, provided this immediate language. You know, it's like what Anne was saying, you know, Amanda, when you ask like what for us is the most is the easiest thing or the best thing? And I said, definitely poetry, because it provides this openness and this world of calm. But the other genres are, for me, equally important. There are some things that I feel I can only do justice to them if I write prose, you know, or if I write an essay. The poetry isn't gonna, wouldn't do what I want to say credit, wouldn't do this particular topic credit. So it's really diving into the world of writing. Writing too is so much about reflection and what it is. You look for the medium that's gonna do justice to the work, to the idea, to the topic.
That's a really great answer. Thank you. Tammy or David?
I don't think that I bring so much fiction into my poetry because I'm much more interested in how I can push language around. And I'm not interested so much in full sentences or like Afua said, sometimes I don't need to like describe going to the door. I just need to get to the door. Whereas on the poetry, into my fiction, I've learned a lot about how to put pressure on a paragraph in a way that you might not be able to if you're just writing fiction. Because I have the poetry background, I think that you are always self-editing and looking at how you're looking at the micro as well as the macro. And I think I've learned a lot of that through writing poetry.
David, any final thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I have a couple. It definitely goes both ways for me. And I have a couple of poems in Humanimus that are sort of quite narrative poems. Narrative scenes, you might say, sort of like monument type of poems. And for those, I've definitely deployed my techniques of creating a scene from fiction writing and brought them into poetry. And there's one that's actually about somebody that Beethoven had a fling with and wrote a really famous, had an infatuation with, and wrote a really famous short piece of music about. And that one was actually originally a story idea. And sort of, I just had this image that often is the way that the beginning of a story will start for me, an initial scene. And for whatever reason, it ended up working its way out as a poem that's sort of on the longer side of poems that I usually write. So I'm a both ways cross-pollinating kind of writer, I guess.
I like that. Cross-pollinating, I like that. And we have one last question, and it's from Heather McKenzie. And it said, I was interested in Tammy's comment that she did not have the vocabulary to write about the places she was not from. How did you get to the point where you felt comfortable writing about them, or did it just take time?
Well, some places I still will write about them from the point of view that I'm an outsider, because I don't feel that I have that vocabulary still. It's just, I've been in Nova Scotia now 6 years, and even the vocabulary that I would maybe think for here, if I'm speaking to people who are local, they have a different vocabulary, and place means different things to different people. So I'm always very careful about, I don't want to say I have this nature guide, and so, therefore I have some authority to write about a place. I think part of that knowing about a place is listening to people who are from there and listening to how they define place. And then you can, of course, I can define place for myself. But if I don't know the names of the plants in my backyard, how am I going to, where do I start? I have to do some reading and some asking questions. And I think it's important, know your questions and then go out. And I think that's a more open way to define place where you are. So my whole collection, I like to think of as just asking questions. I don't have any answers.
Okay, that's a good answer though. So I just have
Thank you.
I have one quick question for you before you guys all go. If you were going to give one tiny quick snippet of advice to an emerging writer on craft, what would it be? Really snippy, quick. What would it be? And I'm gonna start with, because I'm not gonna start with Anne, she's shaking her head. I'm gonna start with Afua.
I would say to go deep within, or maybe not deep within, but go within, and practice. Come back to the work, because to develop, sort of good craft, you have to come back to the work and spend time with it. Yeah.
Good answer. Okay, I'm gonna pick on David.
Okay, I'm gonna risk sounding like the curmudgeonly dad that I am. But first I'll say I have to tell this advice to myself as well. And I think probably most people now, but notifications off, all notifications off, phone in the other room. I'm sorry, I know I sound so lame, but there's studies showing that even having a phone turned off in the same room will decrease your deep focus by 10%. You'll be 10% less likely to be able to deep focus on tasks. So anyway, you all know this. So that's all I'll say.
Okay, perfect. And Anne, one snippet of advice.
Well, this again, it's sort of like what David was saying. It's like the advice that I need to take myself. So, and I was talking to a poet, Tanya Gunvalson Klassen, about risk. And, but I think that, so we were talking about risk and danger, going into the place that's dangerous, but also coming back out of that place, so that, so another friend said that all writing, and I think she was quoting Atwood here, she said all writing is going into the world of the dead, the underworld, and bringing back something or someone. And I thought how apt that is for writing. It's such a risky journey in some ways, and yet it's also playful, but it's risky, and so that going down into the depths and coming back out again, I thought, wow, that's so fascinating. So yeah, I think risking and also playing.
Okay. And the last word goes to Tammy. What little bit of advice would you give?
My advice would be to read widely, read translations. Don't just read your contemporaries. Read people that you don't even feel like you have anything in common with. Read from years ago. I think that's really important, and to make you can make your own opinions, but if you're just reading your contemporaries, I don't know if that you're probably doing yourself a disvalue. And the other is just let your work breathe. You don't need to rush it. Just, I think spending more time with it, you're going to learn more about yourself and more about the process.
Perfect. Very good advice from all of you. I want to thank you very much. So that brings us to the end of our evening tonight. So I just want to thank Tammy Armstrong, Afua Cooper, David Huebert, and Anne Simpson, and everyone in the audience who attended this evening. So thank you so much. I know for myself, I learned a lot, and I'm very grateful for all of you. So walalio, and good night, everyone.
Thank you, Amanda. Thanks to everyone. Bye-bye.
Yeah, nice to meet you.
Thank
you, Amanda.
Thank you, Amanda.